Welcome back. This is the third part of the final series of videos. This is all other people's research on some gender conclusions. What you're going to be looking at in this video is this video that just popped up right here. This is actually a quite humorous and pretty terrible run in the Nexus. There's one player in here who is obsessed with his cat perhaps being on fire and the more repercussions he has of not helping it. It's a really funny, entertaining, really terrible, we died a lot run. We were all having a lot of fun. So this is just to give you something to look at. I won't actually be referencing a whole lot of video in this. In fact, I won't be referencing any video in this video in particular. This is all just going to be me relaying some research on gender conclusions. So here's something nice to look at while I talk at you. We're going to break this down into a few subcategories, and those subcategories are the numbers on gender, gender function versus gender aesthetic, and what are the appropriate gender behaviors in WoW. Now, before we get into these categories, I just want to point out here that some of the research may not directly be tied to World of Warcraft, but we're going to be using it peripherally, and with the hopes that it proves revelatory to you as it did to me. And the whole purpose of this video, before we get into it, is I want to judge some of the conclusions I've come to in the first, second, and third video with some research that's been done in the field. So you're going to be hearing a lot of reiteration of themes that were perhaps brought up in the first two sections of this video or the previous two videos. You're also going to hear the introduction of some themes that are going to be fleshed out in the last two sections of this video. So if you hear common threads, keep in mind that this is me judging my experience in World of Warcraft against others' experience in World of Warcraft in regards to gender. So let's jump into it. The first thing we're going to look at is the numbers on gender. This is pretty simply just an attempt to figure out basic sort of WoW demographics, and I want to point out here before we get into it that finding World of Warcraft demographics in terms of avatar demographics is actually pretty difficult. So I've sort of hit it from three different angles. The first is something called the Dataless Project. This is just to determine actual player base. This is not the avatar, the gender of the avatars, this is the gender of the actual players. And this is just sort of to give you a framework of the player base of World of Warcraft. This was done some years ago, I believe in 2005, so again, keep this in mind. This is not relevant to today's player base, but this is just generally 84%, according to the Dataless Project, of players in World of Warcraft are male, while 16% are female. So that just sort of gives you a breakdown of real-life genders that we're dealing with here. The next thing I want to look at is it comes from an article in which they attempted to find demographics on video games in general. This is not World of Warcraft. This is it was a random sampling of a bunch of different games, and what they found in terms of male and female, this is avatar representation, is out of all the sampling of these games they found that 85% of the characters in all these games, or 85% of the games, had all characters as male, while 14% had all characters as female. They found that 89% had the primary characters in the games as male, while 10% had the primary characters as female. And they found that within these games, 85% also had the secondary characters as male, while 14% were female. So this would translate to World of Warcraft in terms of NPCs, in terms of non-player characters. This is what NPC stands for. So this is the avatars that are designed into the game, the coded avatars. And I actually believe this is a pretty fair representation of how this breaks down in World of Warcraft. Again, the research on this, incredibly difficult to find. I couldn't find any on it. So we're just sort of building around the question, hoping that we arrive at some sort of general understanding of what the numbers of gender are. The last thing we're going to look at is something from PlayOn. They did some avatar. They did an avatar survey for World of Warcraft, and they had a sample size of 178 people, and they did World of Warcraft, Second Life, and MapleStory. And in World of Warcraft, out of 178, they had a sample size of 89 out of that 178, and their percentage of male to female was huge. What's more interesting to me, though, is that their avatar gender, they actually did this for World of Warcraft. They found that the split between avatar gender, between male and female, is relatively even, and in fact they even found that there are slightly more female avatars in their sample size than there are males in terms of just avatars. So this sort of gives us a framework that while there may be a lot more males playing this game, the actual breakdown on male and females in terms of avatars is pretty equal. So now let's move on. This just gives us the framework for our understanding of how genders operate in terms of numbers in World of Warcraft. Let's move on to gender function versus gender aesthetic. I just want to give you a quote here from Deborah Clark. She says that the internet has not provided an escape from gender issues and may not be as gender-free as originally predicted. Social change will probably need to occur in order for the salience of gender to disappear on the internet. And I think this quote gives us a nice sort of atmosphere for the research we're about to break into. So this is the meat and potatoes. This and the following section in the research bit here, the appropriate gender behaviors, is really where we get into the bulk of our research, because it's really important to answer these questions when analyzing gender behavior. So what we're looking at here are aesthetic choices and functional choices. What I really want to look at is gender imperatives and behaviors as afforded by aesthetic choices instead of functional ones. The importance of this is crucial to gender research and WoW. This is the reason, by the way, I want to point this out here, this is the reason I chose to study in-game genders instead of real-life genders, because in analyzing gender affordance and gender behavior, we can reflect a central truth that pops up time and time again in previous studies of digital narratology, which is that the technology provided affords certain behaviors, but that it is the people that use those technologies who ultimately make the choice to prefer some affordances over others. This is ultimately true in World of Warcraft. This means that the only way to adequately study gender in World of Warcraft is to study how people, regardless of their actual gender, act within either of the afforded genders provided to them by Blizzard Entertainment. So everything we're going to be looking at from now on in terms of research of gender, keep within that mindset, keep within that scope, that we are looking at avatar genders, not real life genders, for a reason. I use the real life gender just to give you some idea of the actual player base, but that's not what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with avatars, and there's the reason why, what I just said. It's important to realize that the research regarding in-world gender choices is relatively small compared to the amount of research done on people's real-life genders and how those inform their use of those given affordances by Blizzard Entertainment. And so we should be aware of this moving forward, that a lot of this research has yet to be done, which is why I was so excited to do that. So I want to start out with this fantastic quote, and you're going to see little numbers pop up in the bottom left-hand part of your screen. These are accompanied to a bibliography, so if you're really interested in these sources, get in contact with me and I'll send you the bibliography. If not, just know that there is an accompanying bibliography, this being done for a college course and all, so I'm not going to put it up on the YouTube though. But here's a quote to get us into World of Warcraft specifically. Gender is present in World of Warcraft in many ways, but not necessarily insistent or obvious. So this means that in order to study gender in World of Warcraft, we have to sort of get creative. We have to, if we're going to study avatar gender, we have to really dig in and do a lot of experimentation, which is what I've attempted to do and a lot of other people have attempted to do. Ginny Sunden has a fantastic quote from this article she wrote called "A Sense of Play, Affect, Emotion, and Embodiment in World of Warcraft." And she stipulates in that moving through the spaces of Azeroth is in many ways a journey through a heterosexual landscape. Even if Blizzard has made sure that male and female avatars are equally powerful as vehicles in the game world, i.e. male bodies are not stronger or better by default, female characters of popular races such as humans and night elves regularly become objects of sexual attraction. And that's the end of that quote. So this is going to lead us sort of into a subfield of gender research, which I want to hit on now. And this is alliance gender versus horde gender. We hit on this a little bit earlier. I said I would sort of come back to it, and let's come back to it now. Alliance gender affordances versus horde gender affordances. This is a very contentious issue, which is illustrated by some of the fantastic research done in the field, such as this quote right here. Quote, "The image of gender is not equally clear-cut between alliance and horde races, as femininity in some ways seems to be in conflict with monstrous racial features. Female trolls and orcs seem to have more in common visually with the human-like female alliance races than with their corresponding racial brothers. They seem to be beautified and feminized in ways that draw their visual appearance away from race and toward a more generic femininity, both in their body shapes being shrunk and adjusted into stereotypical female proportions and their faces being beautified away from some of the more monstrous racial features." End quote. So this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, and I think it very eloquently points out that women or female avatars in this game do indeed tend to align more closely with their gender than with their race. And for true illustrations of that, you can really look at all of the horde races. And a little bit later in this same research, the author says this. She says, quote, "It is primarily males then who define the generic races, while females of the most monstrous races are more female than race. The female features have preempted some of the racial features as if they were in conflict. It seems we have encountered a limit of femininity, indicating that femininity has a much stronger resistance than masculinity towards features than, from a Western perspective, are perceived as monstrous and ugly." End quote. Now, all of this suggests, and goes back to this earlier claim, that gender is most relevantly studied in World of Warcraft within the scope of the avatars themselves. And in order to study that, one must focus on the repercussions of aesthetic gender affordances provided by Blizzard Entertainment, at least in conjunction with, or perhaps even instead of, how players' real-life genders affect their gameplay. So let's move on now that we've taken a look back and sort of used some research to highlight gender function versus gender aesthetic. Let's move on Let's move on to the appropriate gender behaviors in WoW, and let's try and answer the question of what are these exactly with some outside research. Now, some of these topics again have been addressed before in regards to my personal experience in World of Warcraft, but this is where I judge my experience against others in the field, so just want to point that out again. I want to break the appropriate gender behaviors into a few categories, which you'll probably recognize, and one new one: discrimination, professions, and sexuality. So let's take a look at discrimination first. This is a quote from some fantastic research. Quote, "It," and the author is talking about female players in WoW here, "it was not an unfriendly dominance. Male players were talked to, listened to, included, and aided just as male players were. But the social space was maintained as one in which males set the rhetorical tone. Sexualized, homophobic language was normalized in text and voice chat, although stopping short of what would probably take place in a men's locker room. Male players casually mentioned things like blowjobs and butt sex. They spoke of raping or being raped by mobs or players in battlegrounds and arenas. They used words such as douchebag, pussy, cunt. The term gay was a generically derisive and liberally invoked adjective. Male players sometimes taunted other males by referring to them as, quote, little girls. I labeled this discourse male," end quote. So again, this goes back to exactly what I showed you guys earlier in the last video of this male-led misogynist sort of discourse that goes on rhetorically and socially within World of Warcraft, and this is a great piece here that points that out, that that's just not my experience. This is a very, very common thing. So now let's move on to professions and examine what sort of role gender has on professions. Here's a quote, "Even though activities with masculine or less clearly gendered associations dominate, it is interesting to note the existence of a handful of activities with feminine associations, which means that World of Warcraft not only presents the traditional invitations to women to act like men, but also invites men to engage in activities associated with women or femininity. An open question, though, is whether this means a feminization of male player characters through involving them in activities associated with femininity, or a defeminization of the activities themselves." And that's the end of that quote. I want to go a little bit further than this quote. I actually think it does suggest a defeminization of those activities themselves. I don't think that is very much of an open question. I don't think it's much of an invitation, as the author suggests, for men to engage in these activities, because of my experience in World of Warcraft in regards to professions. The professions are sort of treated it's more weird to see a female blacksmith than it is to see a male tailor. And the reason I point that out is because the professions, when a male takes on a feminized profession, it doesn't so much seem to me that that male becomes demasculinized for taking that profession, as much as it does that it works that way for females. As much as it does that if a female takes on a masculine profession, she becomes more masculinized. And again, that's just personal experience, but the author sort of stops there. I would go further and say that yes, this is a defeminization of the activities themselves. So now let's move on to sexuality. The first thing you need to know, and this is a quote, on average, 1 in 3 players have found themselves to be attracted to another player, end quote. That's something that's a huge percentage of players. And now let's look at sexuality more acutely. Now that we understand that a huge portion of this population does find some sort of level of sexual attractiveness to this game and the experience of this game, let's move a little bit further and examine sort of attractiveness. And here's another quote. Quote, female orcs and the undead appear to move through the game with greater ease in ways that might suggest a queering of space. Female orcs have a strong, muscular build and can have their heads shaven, or as one informant formulated this matter in relation to her female orc, quote, she's clearly not a babe. In not being a babe, the orc woman fails to fit the hetero norm, but instead of primarily producing a disorienting feeling, this failure appears to generate a certain freedom of movement. Another woman had a similar feeling for her undead, with its slouching posture and with the bones ripping through the skin, as an interesting option to more busty, heteronormalized game bodies, end quote. I think this quote, or this discussion of heteronormalness, is fantastic in regards to sexuality in World of Warcraft, because it in terms of looking at the females on the Alliance side, they are almost all heteronormalized, and a few of the ones on the Horde side are, but not all, as just illustrated here. Also in sexualities, this is more, zooming back out, this quote, and looking at sexuality more generally. Quote, for the players I have met, sexuality figures quite intimately as a part of game culture. They meet up, they flirt, and they have hot play dates across candlelit kitchen tables. World of Warcraft becomes in such moments a space for sexual attraction and desire in ways not predicted by the game design. As late that night when a fairly strong female troll took the lead through the Zoram Strand. The troll was striding on with her long troll legs, the undead right behind her with her slightly slouching way of running. They avoided as much as possible the main road, from which they were easily spotted by the enemy, but had to follow the road a short while in order to proceed. They did not make it very far when suddenly they faced 2 mighty female night elves, and when suddenly they faced death, while night elf laughter echoed through the woods. Quote, it was quite special when we died together that very first time in Ashen Vale. It was like such a romantic moment, like Romeo and Juliet, or perhaps Juliet and Juliet, end quote. So this is more, looking somewhat humorously, but I also think it's very cute in terms of what it reveals about sexuality, in terms of gender relations, and this specific instance is between 2 female avatars, as I'm sure you've noticed. So this again points to, and sort of opens up a new can of worms that we haven't really addressed yet, that sexuality is a huge factor here, and there's a lot of research on this in terms of the role that sexuality has in World of Warcraft, but I think perhaps what might do better is to discuss what I'm going to in the next video here, which is my own experience in World of Warcraft, and my own gender experience, and my own experience with sexuality, and how those things all bled into each other. So now that we've looked at these categories of research, and we've seen that a lot of the claims, if not all the claims that we've found in terms of gender, are backed up by a lot of really good research, both in terms of the numbers on gender, in terms of the gender function versus gender aesthetic, and in terms of gender appropriate behaviors. We've seen that almost all of the research that I did is reflected by a lot of other people. I think it's important now to dig more deeply into my experience in World of Warcraft, So that's what the next video is going to be. It's going to be me talking about my experience with Ginger in World of Warcraft. So I will see you there.